just honored beyond belief to be here, and because my father's first works were published by this company and sold here in the 1930s. And they have a publication here, it's kept in the cupboard over there, Buddhism in the Modern World, Alan W. Watts, John M. Watkins and Son. So that goes way back to his teenage years, back when he was, what, I don't know, 15, 16. He started writing that young, and it was that kind of writing that got him to the Buddhist Society in London. He'd found a brochure about the Buddhist Society in London, and he sent them a pamphlet that he had written. And he was at the time a student at King's College School in Canterbury. And so they invited this Alan Watts to come and speak, expecting a professor. And in walks this 15-year-old student. and so Toby Humphreys, Christmas Humphreys, who was a well-known London barrister, actually, took Alan under his wing and mentored him. And so that was the beginning of that relationship. And so when I heard that Jeremy had arranged for me to be able to come here, which I just was beyond my wildest dreams and never imagined, I remembered that my father had written about this bookstore because this was like his favorite place. And so, not in this book, but in his autobiography, In My Own Way, he wrote about this bookstore, and I just wanted to read you a bit of what he wrote, because I love it. And if you're an aficionado of this store, you'll totally get it. He says, "Thus, with my father's unfailing support and encouragement, I designed my own higher education. I chose Toby Humphreys as my chief preceptor, and he in turn introduced me to Nigel Watkins and his aged father, John. Nigel runs the most magical bookshop in the world and is the most unobtrusively enlightened person I have ever known. The shop is on a secluded place named Cecil Court." Is it Cecil or Cecil?
Cecil.
Cecil Court. So
Cecil
glad I
if you
asked. In London, Cecil Court, at the south end of Charing Cross Road, close to the National Gallery and the Colosseum. He sells books on Oriental philosophy, magic, astrology, masonry, meditation, Christian mysticism, alchemy, herbal medicine, and every occult and far-out subject under the sun. But he himself has, if you will take his own advice, discrimination in what one should read. His father, John M. Watkins, was a disciple of Blavatsky and the close friend of the Gnostic scholar G.R.S. Mead. He was almost blind when I knew him, but he advised me carefully as to what I should read of the principal texts of Hindu philosophy. Nigel not only became my bibliographer on Buddhism, comparative religion, and mysticism, but also my most trusted advisor on the various gurus, pandits, and psychotherapists then flourishing in London. So that was his connection, and every time he was in London, he would get together for lunch with Nigel, and they'd always have a wonderful time. So that's how that way back when context. I want to say to all of you that I am not a student of Zen, and I am not a student of Alan Watts. In fact, I had a terrible time reading his books. I never got very far. I loved listening to him. I grew up listening to him. When I was a child, he was frequently having lectures that I was either brought to, or the lectures happened in our home or whatever, and so I was surrounded by that all the time. And so there was a lot of that just came into me by osmosis. And so without being a student, there's much that I just kind of is my own personal life philosophy, and I flow with that. this book came about because this wonderful publisher, if I can just, New World Library, thank you. New World Library, they've been republishing a lot of Alan's works that have gone out of print. We were at the office of the editor, Joel Gardner, one day and talking about these books that he was working on. And my sister mentioned that we had this collection of our father's letters. And his eyes lit up immediately. And he said, well, something should be done with those, don't you think? And we said yes. And he said, well, we should get those letters and edit them. And my sister said, well, I think we could do that. and so that whole thing was born. And so what we did was I went to Livingston, Montana, where my sister lives. I live in the Bay Area and San Francisco area, Northern California, and we went through all the letters, and we make piles, which ones we thought were good, which ones we thought were maybe, which one, no go, that kind of thing. And it was an amazing collection of letters, and really quite amazing to read, to dive in there, and that's the first time I've really read my father, and it inspired me to read his autobiography, because I was trying to piece together information. And so through his autobiography and that. And quite honestly, if you've read his autobiography, this is much more personal. Because I found in his autobiography, he did a lot more lecturing. He did a lot more, philosophizing than he did get personal. And that's actually how he was as a human being. He wasn't very personal in that sense. He didn't talk about his private life. He just was, and he loved what he did. He absolutely loved what he did. And so we put these letters together, and we put them together chronologically. However, in a book this size, most people don't read it chronologically. Most people open to a page and read right where they are, right? And it doesn't matter, right, wherever you are. But the thing that I love about this is it really shows his development as a thinker. And you really watch the progression of his thinking and his thoughts and how he developed. And what a lot of people don't know is that for a period of time he was an Episcopalian priest. And so he really dove into that fully and thoroughly. And it was like finding, for him to do that, he had to go to the roots of Christianity. Right, he couldn't start at where Christianity got to. He had to dive into really the depths and the meaning behind it all. That's what mattered to him. And so during that time he was very popular as a priest, as he was whatever he did. It's so funny, Jeremiah and I were talking about what an attractive man he was. And he never thought he was attractive. He thought he was homely. And he never dated much at all. And really my mother was the first person that he really got to have the kind of romantic experience that he always dreamed of, right? And so later on, as he became more famous, of course, women were always throwing themselves at him, and it was irresistible. Joan and I, working on this book, we heard about a lover of his that we had never heard of before. And she was a poet, Jean Burden, and she was living in Los Angeles at the time, although they both lived in Evanston, Illinois around the same time, but they didn't know each other then. And that's where I was born. And so... So she wrote that women were like catnip for Alan. The thing is, he was absolutely brilliant. Really, he was a brilliant interpreter of philosophy and Eastern thought for the Western mind, and he had a voracious thirst for knowledge, and he retained everything. he had a photographic memory, among other things. And he loved to, whether it was talking or writing, it just flowed from him constantly. It was just this ongoing flow. And so he was brilliant at that. And his two major foibles were alcohol and women. And I've experienced sometimes that people, when they find out that he was an alcoholic, and he actually became quite a very serious alcoholic, and that he was a womanizer, they knock him off the pedestal. And my belief is that the work that he did stands on its own, that the people all over the world write to us all the time to say how his work has transformed their lives in some way. How many people in this room have had some experience of that, like reading Alan Watts has made a difference in your life? And look around and just see, right? And to me, that's what matters. You know, the fact that he was an alcoholic, the fact that he was a womanizer is nothing compared to that impact on the world. And so my want is people to just have compassion for the things that didn't work well in his life, and really drink of that's meaningful to you, right? And so I'm actually going to read a few letters because I think that's really what you're here for. So I want to start back when he was 13 years old. And the one I'm going to read to you is one that is a bit of British history here, written in 1928 when he was at King's School, Canterbury. And he writes that a lot of these letters are written to Dear Mummy and Daddy. And he says, Dear Mummy and Daddy, thank you for your last letter. I have got crowds of news for you this week. I shall see the enthronement of the Archbishop, all right. Another boy and myself have got to carry his train, all in caps. We have got to dress up in all sorts of complicated affairs. We have got to wear ruffs and red cassocks. I have been to several rehearsals for the service, and it is going to be a very pompous affair. The Premier and the Lord Chancellor are going to be there, and the Lord Mayor of London. We have got to go to the Archbee's palace and wait in the hall till he comes, and then pick up his train and follow him. And then he goes on with more school news. But we have a photograph that was in the newspaper of my father carrying the train. So that's in the book. And another letter I'd like to share with you is one that he wrote at the age of 21 to Carl Jung. So Carl Jung gave a lecture here in London, which my father attended. And the next day he wrote him this letter. This is October 17th, 1936. Dear Sir, I was rather surprised to hear you say in your lecture at Caxton Hall last night that you never found any mandalas with 6 divisions. Of course, the Buddhist wheel of life is almost always divided into 6, but perhaps you have some reason for not regarding this as a mandala in the strict sense of the word. I am enclosing herewith a reproduction of a Tibetan wheel of life, which you may like to add to your collection if you have not already got it. Apart from the 6 divisions, another feature which distinguishes it from the usual mandala is its center. Almost all the examples you showed, except some produced by pathological cases, had at the center some kind of holy of holies, a temple, an egg, or a golden ball. The Buddhist wheel, however, has a cock, a snake, a hog, the symbols of lust, raga, ill will, dosa, and stupidity, moha. I have never come across any instance of it being used for magical purposes. Probably it is only used as a formal representation of the 6 worlds of samsara, a picture rather than a symbol. The unusual center, however, seems to mark it as an essentially world-denying picture. That is to say, enlightenment or individuation does not consist in going to the center of the circle, but in escaping from it altogether. For this reason, it might be called the reverse side of the usual mandala. It represents the philosophy of neti-neti as distinct from tattvan asi. Although the two are really opposite ways of doing the same thing, or as is said in the secret of the golden flower, between the all and the void is only a difference of name. And he goes on, and let's see, yeah, and he just goes on a little more. It's more than I think you want to just hear it all, but 21 years old, writing to Carl Jung. It's amazing. And the two later did become good friends, actually, and my father frequently went to the Jung Institute in Switzerland and gave talks there. And so, but I love that he wrote that. A lot of this stuff, so here's one thing that I think is really such a pertinent thing. I call this part thinking out loud. A woman had written to him, and she had some consternation about something that didn't line up with something that she had read of his before. And in his lengthy response to her, these letters are amazing. They're voluminous. And he frequently apologizes in the letters, saying, I'm sorry for writing so long, but that's how he was. It just never stopped coming out of him. Anyway, so I'll just read to you two little bits out of this letter. He says, if I may quote from the preface to the Supreme Identity, I am not one of those who believes that it is any necessary virtue in the philosopher to spend his life defending a consistent position. It is surely a kind of spiritual pride to refrain from thinking out loud and to be unwilling to let a thesis appear in print until you are prepared to champion it to the death. Philosophy, like science, is a social function, for a man cannot think rightly alone, and the philosopher must publish his thought as much to learn from criticism as to contribute to the sum of wisdom. I really love that. And then he said, I shall continue to write because it's my nature. The Supreme Identity will be out in September and represents an intermediate stage between Behold the Spirit and what I think now. What shall I think tomorrow? I don't know. The whole fun of life is that it's full of new surprises and new things to learn, provided you are always willing to keep on growing and not settle into a rut. Right? So I just think that was something that's useful for all of us to hear. I have a letter to Timothy Leary about a drug experience. I heard a letter about Native Americans, which I love, a piece on death. I have a piece on police image, which is, you know, his writing is completely timeless. Like, it's as valid and up-to-date today as it was when he first wrote it. And how many of you are listeners to YouTube, Alan Watts on YouTube? Quite a few of you, yeah. And I think it's a wonderful way to introduce yourself to his thought and philosophy, besides which he always sounded so wonderful. It's just the best voice. And so, yeah, that's often the way I recommend people start, is just listening to him on YouTube. But my father worked at Yale with them, and he was one of their guinea pigs. You know, like he would take the drugs, LSD, and in this case, psilocybin. And then he would describe exactly what his experience was. And so, so this is one of those moments when he's describing his experience. I'm most indebted to you. I don't know what CY39, psilocybin, does for other people, but for both Mary Jane, his third wife, Mary Jane Jano, and myself, it has been profoundly healing and illuminating. She will write you independently as soon as she can find time. She has a very interesting story of using it to carry her through a nasty situation with her mother, and is now saying, for the first time, I feel really weaned. I took it yesterday at 10:30 a.m. The external circumstances were ideal, as we were spending the day in a kind of earthly paradise owned by some very dear friends, all of whom have experienced LSD. This made it very easy for me to talk with others during the experience. Otherwise, things were rather gloomy. I was very tired after my trip east, suffering from a virus throat, financially harassed, needing a rest, and quite disinclined to work. During the hour after taking the first 5 pills, I felt terrible. Very weak, rather sick at the stomach, no appetite for breakfast, throat feeling as if I were swallowing a billiard ball. I had the feeling that this medicine was no escape, no rest, but an intensification of reality. So I just lay down and waited. About 11:25, everything changed, and I decided to take the second dose. At this point, we were listening to some Hindu music, a set of London records prepared for UNESCO by Elaine Danilou. As I listened, I was quite startled to realize that the music was pure nonsense, and yet it said on the label classical music, that the classical music of India, and Danilou is a very stuffy scholar. Nevertheless, the singers were not singing words, they were lulling, playing with syllables, dit-da stuff, and blowing their oboes just to make weird, spontaneous noises. There was nothing classical about it. It was the most abandoned, delightful blathering. Now, at the time, I thought this was the usual LSD effect in which everything ceases to be serious. I thought my friend had just put on a record of some sort of jam session, but he said, no, this is serious Hindu music. I asked to see the record envelope, and that's what it said it was. Now, the joke is that I listened to it again 6 hours later, and that nonsense is what it still is. These happen to be very unique records in which the human voice is used as an instrument. No Sanskrit or Hindi, just bwa wah bwa. And then he goes on, and then there, a few paragraphs later, he says, thereupon I was somehow plunged immediately into the most vivid cosmic consciousness experience I have ever had. It was so marvelous that I called everyone to come into the room. I've got to explain this to you, I said, but there's no reason why you have to understand. You're all divine. You're all Buddhas just as you are, without having to know what I'm talking about. But the point is that life is a gesture of motion, of color, of sound, and there isn't anyone making the gesture, or to whom or for whom it is happening. There is simply no problem of life. It is absolutely purposeless play. It doesn't have to continue. There is no reason whatever to explain it. For explanations are just another form of complexity, a new manifestation of life on top of life, gestures gesturing. If there is any problem at all, it is to find out how people come to think that there is a problem. Whatever made them imagine that life is serious. Basically, there is the gesture. Time, space, multiplicity are all complications of it. Pain and suffering are very far out forms of play, and there just isn't anything at all to be afraid of. There isn't any ego. The ego is a kind of flip, knowing that you know, like being afraid of being afraid. It's a curlicue, an extra jazz to things, to sort of double take or reverberation, a dithering of consciousness, which is the same as anxiety. I love that. So, my favorite part of these events is the question and answer part. So I want to open it to you guys. If there's any question you want to ask, I'll do my best to answer. Yes?
I loved listening to the letters. I'm just a little bit, I'm not really sure how it is that letters that he had written were available to you to put into this anthology.
What a good question. Well, the letters to Mommy and Daddy were letters that they saved. You know how parents can be.
Yeah.
And all the other letters, on the cover of the book, you'll see the typewriter. he typewrote all of those letters, and he kept carbon copies. So it's the carbon copies that he did. And this book just fell off the shelf to remind me, that this book is an amazing book. It is the story of my mother's mother, Ruth Sasaki, Ruth Fuller Everett Sasaki. She became the first woman and the first foreigner accepted as a priest, not a priestess, a priest, in the Zen temple in Japan. And she had a temple in Kyoto at Daitokuji, which is a famous Buddhist center in Kyoto. And so it's her story and the story of her husband, Sokian Sasaki, who was instructed by his teacher to come to America to teach Buddhism to Americans. And so it starts out telling his story, telling her story, telling his story, telling her story, until they combine. And of course, because my mother married Alan Watts, who wrote to Sokian when he was a teenager. There's a letter in this here that he wrote to Sokian when he was a teenager. And there's a letter from Sokian to Alan in this book. The books interweave. But this is an amazing story to read no matter what. And the woman who put it together, she based it on hundreds of hours of tapes that Gary Snyder made of interviews with my grandmother. And so that was like kind of the basis, and she did enormous research, and then Stephen Schwartz was the one who kind of brought it to life in language. And they're hoping it gets made into a movie because it's such an amazing story. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for dropping down on me. La 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 la. Well, okay, the one that comes into mind is when I was a teenager, I guess, 17, I must have 18. We were in New York City, and Al Huang, Chung-Lian Al Huang, who finished his last book, and Alan and I were together. Alan and Chung-Lian were doing a seminar together, and we just started dancing down the streets of New York together. And that was always my fantasy. I was a great lover of musicals. And I felt like that's how life should be. We should all be singing and dancing, you know, like down the streets. And so there we were doing my dream. So that's one of my favorite memories. Thank you. Yes?
As you notice, I'm just standing next to a whole volume of books by Joseph Campbell.
Oh, yes.
I noticed that in the letter compilation there's a couple of letters there,
yes,
and an exchange of pies.
Right.
And I wonder if you could elaborate on their relationship.
They were very good friends. Of course, you know, they were very much of like mind. And Joseph Campbell's wife, beautiful woman who was a dancer, and we used to hang out with them a fair amount. And they mostly lived in New York, but they were very good friends. Yeah, so, yeah. That's pretty much, you know, I was a little kid. Lots of famous people came and went in my household, and, you know, it's just how it was. Yeah, thanks. Who else? Yes?
From your memories, do you remember maybe, because obviously lots of people come into your home all the time, was there like a favourite story that he'd always tell, you know, like, oh, tell the one about this, or you know, is there a favourite kind of thing that he would always say, you know, do you understand what I'm getting at?
A favourite story of mine, or a favourite story of his?
A favourite story of Alan's, from what you recall, when people come around, like, is it,
right,
you know, is that story you probably heard it maybe 100 times, he's done it in front of guests?
No, I don't think so.
Really not?
No.
Okay.
I think he was so much in the moment.
Right.
You know, he wasn't one of those people where you go, oh, that again, right? That wasn't my experience of him.
Okay.
Yeah. It's good,
All right,
good
thank
question.
you for answering.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Yes.
Who did Alan consider to be his mentors?
Well, like I say, Toby Humphreys, Christmas Humphreys, and Nigel Watkins, hugely, were his mentors. He really, he wanted a Zen teacher, and he tried to study with Sokyan, and but he could not. He just didn't have it in him to do the formal practice, which my grandmother had. She did the formal practice. My father tried, and after trying, if you read in here, you'll read how he tried to get it, and it wasn't working for him, and so it wasn't his path, it wasn't his way. Yeah. So, other than that, I don't think he thought of people so much as mentors as friends. You know, like the Joseph Campbells of the world, and like Carl Jung. I mean, at 21 to write a letter like that to a man much your senior, you know, and his relationship with Toby was always very equal. It never felt like this kind of thing. So that's the best answer I think I can give to that. Is that helpful? Yes.
Hi. How old were you when he passed away?
How old? He passed away in, somebody do the math, in 1973, and I was born in 42.
Right.
How old?
What's your maths?
Somebody got the number? 31? Yeah. Yeah.
And so his drinking was, there was a reason behind that. And he passed away at such a young age as well. I think he was, like you say, 58. Have you looked into or connected the dots in terms of, or maybe he stated why he would prefer or like to drink or wanted to drink or felt he had to?
One of the saddest stories, did you all hear her question? Yeah, good. So one of the saddest stories for me, when I was living with my family in North Carolina for a period of time, and my sister was in California with her family, and they spent a lot of time with Alan then. And while they were there, my sister questioned him about his drinking, and he said, "The only time I like myself is when I'm drunk." That's a heartbreaking thing to hear. My own story that I make up in my head is that he was a very highly sensitive person, and he I don't think he really knew how to discipline himself in certain ways. And so if there's something called catnip out there, right, the cat's going for the catnip. And I think it pained him, the pain that it caused his wives. Of course, I grew up with that, and I thought, if you're a lover to someone and you become married to them, don't expect them to change their stripes and be faithful to you, right? Not likely to happen, and I rarely ever see that change occur. But I think that, and then he had 7 children, and he had to work really hard on an artist's salary to support all those people, and then his second wife, when they split up, sent him hate mail regularly. So I think all of those things just were weights that he carried. And when he was drunk, or there's a different story for me with him and drugs, but when he was drunk, he was somewhat free from that, right? For me and him and drugs were a sacred thing. It really was. He was not an abuser of drugs ever, but he considered it sacred experience. Yeah. Yes.
You all know, we all have our own take on Alan Watts from what we've read and the videos and
Right.
the speeches and everything. And obviously there's another side to him that we'll get more of an insight from this book.
Right.
But as his daughter, what's your personal take on who he was as a man, not as the famous Alan Watts? What's your...
My experience of him was that he's a very kind man, very caring. You'll pick it up in a lot of letters that he wrote to people, just the kindness and the time that he gave them. And he loved to play. He loved to dance. He loved to sing. He loved to draw. In fact, he thought he'd be an artist before he became well known as a writer and a lecturer. But he was a very caring, loving man. He was also very intuitive. A friend of ours used to see him sometimes for some counseling. And she said one time she was in his office, and he reached out and he touched her knee, and he said, "I don't want you to be afraid. In a moment we're going to have an earthquake." And sure enough, in a moment there was an earthquake. You know, so he had that kind of intuitive thing going on as well. So it's one of the reasons why I say he was highly sensitive.
He strikes me as a wondrous man.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering whether you found him a wondrous father. You know, was there something magical?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I share in the same sort of delight in everything in nature that he had.